Today we're going to be talking about this great report, so the role of green gas in net zero, a report that was published by the Anaerobic Digestion and Bioresources Association, or ADBA, of which you're chair, and supported by ourselves at BMA using our Decisio platform for the in-depth analysis behind it, which is obviously a whole systems view and the role of biogas and biomethane within that. So yeah, I had a few questions I was keen to just revisit. To start off with, going back to our first meeting, where I spoke about Decisio and the whole system approach, whole energy systems view. Something sparked, I thought, when we had that conversation with you. You saw something that you hadn't seen before. So maybe you can just sort of talk a little bit about what was different and why you were keen to work with us in the first place.
Yes, I think that the really big attraction of what BMA is able to offer is this whole system approach. And I think that there are, in the energy space, an awful lot of people who are working away at doing little bits without seeing how everything fits together. And I've been traditionally quite keen on overall modelling. I'd done years ago modelling of the whole economy using the Treasury model as part of the independent Treasury Economic Modelling Group. And I think what clicked was the capacity to do the same thing with the Decisio system so that you could actually see how the pieces knit together and indeed see whether we were missing anything in the discussion about what could work. And I had a suspicion for quite a long time that the debate about the whole energy system was frankly a bit naive, in that people were looking at the levelized cost, i.e. the cost to a business of installing solar or installing wind, and were assuming that that was the sort of real cost for the whole system. And the system costs, the backup costs, in a northern hemisphere country like the whole of Northern Europe, most of North America, are potentially enormous with that, because what you're getting with wind and what you're getting with solar is fantastically cheap electricity, but only when there's wind or only when there's solar. And of course, in the northern hemisphere, the peak electricity use and the peak energy use tends to be in the period December through February, when there's very little solar because we have very short days, and the peak electricity use is actually when it's dark and people come home from work. It gets dark in the UK at 4:30 in the afternoon, and at that time of the winter. So you need the backup. So the whole energy system look was really attractive.
I mean, I think it's been really well received because of those points, really contextualizing the role and looking at it as, I think, what we call the big green battery. And that's that backup capability and able to sort of deal with some of those peak points. I think that probably covers my next question, which is really, why does that matter? I think you touched on the cost elements as well, but this is different. Looking at a whole system versus silos, you see the nuances in between.
I mean, I think to give credit where it's due, I think that the people who began thinking about this, as they often do about other things as well, are the Danes. I mean, I think Denmark has had a quite important sort of thought leadership role in whole system thinking, and their phrase is the big green battery in using biomethane. And the key thing that you have with biomethane as an input into the energy system is that you can compress it very easily in the gas grid, you can store it, you can bring it out when you need it, and that is an incredible advantage compared with the intermittent renewables. And it fits very well with the intermittent renewables precisely because you don't have a high capital cost of using it with a gas turbine. Your cost is really the fuel cost. And that makes it incredibly different to something like nuclear, which is exactly the opposite. You have hardly any fuel costs because the uranium is a very small part of the total cost. You have massive capital cost, and therefore once you've built it, you really want to make it work 24 hours a day. I mean, you don't want to use it to back up wind and solar. So what I think the study that we did really shows is that energy sources which have relatively high fuel cost, very low capex cost, are able to really cut the overall whole energy system cost. And I think that's the sort of fundamental takeaway. And the most obvious one of that is biomethane. And I think that people had overlooked biomethane because it's such a small part of the overall grid now. If you actually manage to build it up, you can really make enormous savings, as we discovered in this report, looking at 7% savings on whole energy.
Yeah, this agricultural material
is really big. I mean, £400 per UK household per year. So, this is a lot of money.
So where to next then? Because obviously the whole idea when we set about this was not for it to be a one-off exercise.
Yeah.
Where do you see this going? What do you see in terms of next steps, both in terms of policy discussions and actually sort of bringing to life the role of green gas and biomethane, not just for net zero in 2050, but also its role in clean power 2030 as well?
Yeah. And I think one of the interesting things that came out of the report was the fact that it was not just were we able to make substantial savings on what had been thought to be the costs of reaching net zero in 2050, but also the British new Labour government's objective of clean power by 2030 could also substantially reduce the cost of that, and indeed make it, frankly, a more plausible target by making it a much more robust and achievable target than was previously thought. So I think the next steps are to get it really stuck into the whole policy-making process, and that's not just policy-making at the high level of the government, but also the Committee on Climate Change, also NESO, which is the energy systems operator, also, of course, the people who will ultimately have to make the decisions about the capital expenditure, which will be a big haggle between the grid operators and Ofgem.
Yeah.
So, we're looking here at the most extraordinary amount of capital expenditure in the energy system. And the energy system absorbs a vast amount of capital expenditure anyway, even if you just want to keep it ticking over on business as usual without the sort of transition that we're trying to make towards net zero.
Yeah.
But if you're trying to make that transition towards net zero as well, you're looking at vast capital expenditure budgets, and it's really sensible before embarking on what a very long lead time, very high ticket, big ticket costs, that you know what you're doing and you've really thought it through. And I think that the Decisio model process is a very good, I'm sure it's not, this isn't by any means going to be the last word in this whole thing. I think that it's injected into the debate a really interesting and sensible way of looking at the whole energy system and trying to put the pieces together.
And one of the things there that's, I think, really chanted us is that sort of evidence-based collaboration. As you said, there's an acknowledgement that this is a collaborative exercise, needs to be. There's not one solution. It's not going to be all electricity or all hydrogen. It's going to be a mixture, and every technology and energy vector is going to play its part. But I think one of the things that we've discovered, and interested in your perspective, is that sort of evidence-based collaboration. So it's not necessarily a single answer, but actually grounding the debate on evidence beyond the start, allowing people to pull the different levers, change assumptions, but at least allow them to coalesce around a plan.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the takeaways I got from this exercise, which I thought was quite interesting, is that I've come at this whole energy system thinking business really as an economist. And I had assumed if you look at the basic way in which the energy system works now, that the reason why we have all these different technologies now is because at any given point in the past, when the investment decision was taken, the final investment decision was taken, that looked like the sensible thing to do. And I'd assumed that was why we have this patchwork quilt. Yeah. But in fact, I think what the modeling shows us is it's not just a question of doing one vintage after another. What it shows us is that if you try and stretch any particular technology too far, you get into the point of the curve where you get diminishing returns or rising costs. And that actually is the point at which it becomes much less attractive. So what the injection of a new element of biomethane and green gas into the system does means that you have to push a lot of the other technologies less far, and you push them less far down their rising cost curve, and as a result you make big savings. You don't have to overbuild as much in terms of wind turbines, so you don't get to the really expensive bits, which once you've used up all the really good, really windy sites. Similarly on solar, similarly on nuclear, small savings there. Similarly on transmission lines, because you're going to need less. And so, what you're doing is by introducing more potential technological solutions, you're asking any given technological solution to do less, and you're reducing the cost because you're making sure that it's not getting to that point where the costs are really rising because you're having to exploit opportunities that are a lot more expensive than the ones that you've got right now.
Nice, makes total sense to me. So just zooming out a little bit, obviously the UK government is focused on positioning the UK as a leader in energy transition and achieving net zero and probably broader sustainability as well, but at least in the energy transition, as well as at the same time positioning as a leader in AI, talking about the AI infrastructure required for that. Obviously, from our perspective, we use AI to effectively assist with infrastructure planning, so that to some extent that involves planning the AI infrastructure. So it's an interesting sort of relationship we have, but interested in terms of your view in terms of that broader innovation space. What does that look like going forward? How can UK use its strengths to better position in that space?
Well, I think that I'm not aware of anybody else who has yet done that whole system modeling. And therefore there is a potential there which is really interesting. I mean, clearly if you look at particular sectors like biomethane and the growth of biogas, then there is big potential for developing an export market, because all of the northern hemisphere countries are going to have exactly the same problem. They've all got exactly the same issue of peak energy demand in a dark winter when there's low solar yield, and you can get really quite long periods with pretty low wind as well, what the Germans call Dunkelflaute.
Yeah.
So, we're looking here at something which is by no means just a British problem. This is the entire northern hemisphere. Now, when you look into the tropics, you look to hotter climes, the whole energy use pattern is quite different. But I can foresee that thinking in a holistic sense about the whole energy system is going to make similar savings there. They won't be the same sort of savings. I mean, for example, if you're in Texas or Arizona, your peak electricity use doesn't tend to be heat, it tends to be air conditioning. And that tends to match up rather well with solar yield. So you get a very high sunshine, you get very high solar yield, and you get very high demand for air conditioning. Now, we would love to have that sort of situation in a northern hemisphere country. But if you're in Canada, Germany, Denmark, Sweden, Britain, Finland, you've got exactly the opposite problem. You've got this massive solar yield when you don't much need it in the middle of the summer, or not massive as massive as Texas or Arizona, but you've got quite high solar yield. But that's not when the electricity actually needs to be used. It needs to be used December to February when you've got that dark winter. So I think that the whole energy system modeling is really crucial for every national system to look at. And the fact that you can then get into some really quite detailed answers about how do you build out transmission lines, where do you put the generation and so forth, because of the spatial planning applications of Decisio, I think is very interesting as well. So I foresee that there are some real opportunities, obviously good opportunities for you as a business, but real opportunities for the UK in having begun to think this process through and looking at what are on the face of it, quite small renewable technologies like biomethane, but which can have a really big impact on the overall energy system, precisely because they have one big advantage in net zero world, which is you can turn them on and turn them off.
Yeah.
And they're actually available there in the middle of the winter, which, I'm afraid in the UK, the sunshine is not.
Yeah. Oh, that's brilliant. It really feels like we've laid the foundations for something really interesting here and something that I think can evolve over time, both in terms of biomethane and green gas, but also, as you said, other technologies that could also play that complementary role. So I think thank you very much for having us here. I loved the conversation, loved working with ADBA, and hopefully we'll take this a long way. As a final sort of closing statement, I know you looking at policy, looking to influence that policy. What would be a success coming out of this for the ADBA in terms of working with your members and adjusting policy? You're seeing what policy?
I think the two things which should be a success, I think we're getting there already. One is to ensure that policymakers at all levels of the energy system, and including the people who actually have to press the button for final investment decision, the CEOs of the infrastructure companies, that they've actually got an understanding of how the whole system can fit together, which the modeling allows you to do. And I think there'll be massive opportunities for different bits of the energy system that the UK is really, really good at to develop export markets, including the consultancy side, and just providing the software solutions which allow people to think it through for themselves, because every country is going to be slightly different. And the other aspect of it, which I think is really important, is that don't overlook what appear to be relatively small bits of the system, because they can have an outsized impact on what's going on. So, I think historically policymakers have looked at biogas and biomethane as a nice to have, but pretty small scale part of the system. And because it's only a fraction of total gas, don't have to worry about it very much. But actually, I think what this whole energy system modeling shows is that biogas and biomethane have that potential to really reduce system costs, because they have this sort of unique dispatchability element. It can be turned on, turned off when you need it.
Yeah, that flexibility.
And that flexibility is absolutely crucial. And the one thing, solar and wind are marvelous. And the collapse of solar costs is absolutely fantastic. But the one thing it can't give you in a Northern European country or a Northern Hemisphere country is that backup in the middle of the dark winter.
As you say, the big green battery.
The big green battery.
On that note, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Michael. It was very good collaboration, and I'm delighted to have been able to do it. I think we've actually got a lot of insights out of it, which are really important.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Gabe.